Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm delighted to be on this august panel with some of the nation's greatest servants in the cause of trying to educate our children better. I just want to say to all of you that it's a delight to be here again at this wonderful Summit on Education Reform. As I say, that it's great to come to this summit and to meet those of you who are really working so hard on these issues in every venue, whether it's at the state level, all the way to the parental and level. I just want to thank you for what you do every day for the education of our children. I want to just say it's awfully good to have Governor Bush back with us. So Jeb, thank you. It's great to have you back. And what I propose to do is to spend a little time with my friends talking about the opportunities and challenges for education. I am, gentlemen, going to dispense with your titles. So I am going to call you by first names.
Good.
And you will do the same with me.
Okay.
So let's get started. This is an exciting time for education reform. We were just talking about the degree to which we have been able to sustain, Roberto and I were talking about the degree to which we've been able to sustain for some time a sense that one of the most important things that our country can do is to give our children the best possible education. And for education reformers, we know the importance of reform of education. We know the importance of delivering quality education to every child. I had an opportunity to work with Joel Klein on a task force for the Council on Foreign Relations called Education Reform and National Security. And the premise of that task force was that the country really must educate its children as a matter of national priority. It is a national security issue because we have to have the very best people. Today, serving in the military, it's very hard to get people even able to pass the basic skills test to get into the military. To be a competitive country, we need to educate our people in the jobs and the skills of today. But also the very social fabric of our country is either increased by education or diminished by it. The United States of America is a country in which we are not held together by ethnicity or nationality or religion. We're held together by an aspiration, a belief. You can come from humble circumstances and you can do great things. And the key to making that belief true is a high-quality education for every child. And so this is literally a conversation about the foundation and the strength of our democracy. It's also the beginning of a new administration. And I'd like to start by asking each of you to think back to that moment when you came in to your positions in a new administration and the possibilities that were before you, and to talk a little bit about how far we've come and what we have left to do, and how would you advise our great friend, when she is confirmed, Betsy DeVos, who is going to be the Secretary of Education, and we're all very proud of that. But what would you advise? You only have limited capital, you only have limited time. Those first few steps that you take are really important. So how should we think about those first steps? And Bill, I'm going to start with you as the senior member of this panel. No, I meant in terms of service,
Am I older than Rod Page?
All in terms of your service?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and experience, I guess, yeah. First, I have a question for you. Is it strength of schedule, or is it the best team as we go in? What would you rather talk about? Really, really?
Bill, I'm going to say to you and to everybody out there that's got a team, tell them to prove it on the field, and we'll notice.
Okay. I guess that's to me too, right? All right, prove it on the field. I guess my advice would be, I was taken when I got the job with how many people were interested in talking to me and liked me, who didn't like me before. A horde of people. And to cut through it, I realized they thought I had something to do with what happened in America's classrooms. And I think you only do very remotely. The action in America is in those classrooms, in those schools, in those states. I would urge Betsy to remember that, not to meet with everybody, Because when I met with people, I realized they didn't think I was the Secretary of Education. They thought I was the Secretary of the Treasury for Education. It wasn't about ideas, it was about bucks. But on a practical level, administration, we all know this. Administration is personnel. And you've got to get people in there who believe what you believe, who believe what the president-elect believes, and start administering. We got known after 2 years as Fort Reagan, which was fine by me. The press regarded it as disparaging. I thought it was great. I thought it was a compliment. But then focus on your goals, hire your people, and recognize that the action is elsewhere. Just let me take one more minute. With ESSA, with the Every Student Succeeds Act, this is now formalized in law. It is back to the states. I'm in an organization, Concerned Leaders for Education, which is working with pivotal people, often forgotten, the state legislators, the people who care about education in the states, to make education better in the states. Final comment. I would worry less about, if I were out in the states, I would worry less about compliance. I hope people in the states will have to worry less about compliance with the federal government and compliance with sound educational practice. Get the federal government out of the way, step out of the way. When I meet, as I will this afternoon, I've met already a couple of times with these state legislators, they're bubbling over with ideas. There are lots of things they have that they want to do, and they can do them if we get behind them. I think that's the key.
Okay. Rod, let's stay in order here.
Yeah, okay. So I think what I would talk to her about is become aware of the fact that education policy is only good to the extent it changes education practice. And so we have a gaping gap between education policymakers and education practitioners. And so as she moves forward, being aware of that and trying to find systems to bring those things together, maybe even changing education policies from being so much, being so descriptive to allowing those who the policy most impacts to play a larger role in designing that policy, so that the policy doesn't become a compliance issue for them, but it becomes an issue that they want to use to improve education. To the extent that it's only responded to as a compliance issue, I think it fails to be successful.
Good, yeah. Arne, jump in here.
A couple quick thoughts. First of all, I think we all are here because we feel a huge sense of urgency, that there are far too many kids in the country not getting the kind of education they need. When kids don't get that, they basically don't have a chance in life. So the cost of educational failure, as the economy has changed over the past 20, 30 years, has gone up exponentially. And the critique, I think, that we often got is that we were going too fast. I think the honest critique I give myself is we were going far too slow. And I don't think there's a state or a district in the country that can say they are both raising the bar and closing the gap fast enough. So you've got to come with a huge sense of urgency because kids have one chance at a great education. Secondly, one of my greatest critiques of us in the education community is we spend lots of time debating what I call small ball stuff and not focused on goals. And we can debate strategies, but we need to be very clear on goals. And I would see 4 goals that I think are not Republican or not Democrat. I think we should try and give every kid access to a high-quality early childhood education, so they start pre-K ready to go. I think we should try and get high school graduation rates up to 90% as fast as we can. We've seen some real progress. We have a long way to go. I think we should try and eradicate dropout factories. That's almost like a public health issue, like we eradicated polio. I think we need to make sure that 100% of high school graduates are truly college and career ready. And finally, I think we need to try and lead the world in college completion rates again. Now, we could have lots of vigorous debate, and we should try lots of different innovative things to achieve those goals. But you don't hear almost any political leaders or education leaders talking explicitly about these are goals for the nation. And I'd love her to start there.
Yeah. Roberto, you're getting ready to exit in a little while. And so talk a little bit about how you see the handoff. And let me put it in this context, and I'd like to return to this issue. I do think that we have established a bipartisan, essentially almost nonpartisan sense that the education of our children is a high national priority. And we've seen people working together across the aisles. We may not always agree on the specifics, but I think the idea that education is, in a sense, the new civil right is one that is widely spread. So how do you think about this transition and how to keep that idea alive?
Well, I think we're at a really important moment here in American education, and I think we're really encouraged that this principle of civil rights is a principle that animated the most recent reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It is a principle that was part of the original ESSA that President Johnson shepherded through, and it's one that says that educational opportunity and economic advancement go hand in hand. And so I would really urge that we continue to embrace that principle on a bipartisan basis and do more to make sure that we embrace the work that is being led at the state and at the local level around this change. We have a new national imperative for college and career readiness for all of our students. And this is work that I think many of our state leaders, our governors, our districts across the country have been hard working at for over the course, certainly, of the president's administration, and even reaching back before that. So the last thing we want to do is lose our focus on college and career readiness for all students. And I think we need to do more to make sure that we're returning and supporting some of the decision-making at the state and local level around that work, and that we're embracing innovation. As Arne mentions, we have to go further, faster here if we're going to close the achievement gap, and that requires us embracing some new models and ideas around how we support teaching and learning in our schools. So I think this notion of innovation to really drive greater improvement in our education system, we've seen tremendous progress across the country, and we need to make sure that we build on that and support that at the national level.
Let me put a question out on the table and just ask anyone to respond, and please respond to each other. One of the kind of enduring questions is we are one country. We understand that. And clearly, children in Alabama and California and Texas and Vermont need to have some sense that they have skills or capacities that are reached by a certain point in time. We want a third grader in Alabama and a third grader in Texas and a third grader in California to be equally capable. But it does raise the enduring question of what is really the proper role of the federal government in this, and what is the proper role of state and localities, because as much as we are one country, we are also a country built on principle of federalism, runs deep through our policy, through our political instincts, and in education, federalism, or local control as it's often called, is very much at the center of many people's thinking. So how do we think about the proper, I won't say the tension between, but let's say the proper balance between what the federal government does and how we think about the responsibilities of state and local government. So anybody can start, and we'll just,
We'd probably all come at this in slightly different ways. It'll be an interesting conversation.
Yeah.
So, I've spent lots of time trying to figure out what I think is the appropriate federal role, and I'd come down to three things. One is a focus on equity, and I would put things like early childhood education in there. I would put fighting for kids' civil rights in there. I would put, they had to take troops to desegregate schools in your home state and others. That's in there. Secondly, I think at the federal level, you have to fight for excellence, high standards for everybody. And the third one for me would be what Roberto mentioned, is innovation. And that a lot of what we try to do, we had the Invest in Innovation Fund, the I3 Fund, which were great ideas not coming from the president or not coming from me, but great ideas coming from local communities and just trying to scale where there was evidence. And it was interesting, you had both some bipartisan support, but frankly, lots of bipartisan pushback. And we had many more good ideas than we were able to fund. But I think, Conda, you're asking a related but slightly different question, which I think relates to measurement. Like, how do we know? And I think historically in education, folks have done a great job of hiding those facts, of making that as opaque as possible, and having lots of different ways to measure. And talk about football, football scores are in the paper and there's one way to measure who won the game or not. If you own a business and you have a publicly traded company, your stock price is in the paper every single day. But historically, there's been no way to measure kids in Alabama versus in Massachusetts versus in California, and we're all competing for the same jobs. And I think in education, our willingness to hide those facts, to not be transparent, to not having those honest conversations, I think are great for politicians and great for adults and very destructive to kids trying to make it in life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Bill, you want to get it?
Yeah, I would comment on that. I agree 100% about hiding the facts. Don't hide the facts, more publicity, more sunlight. Brandeis said that sunlight is the best disinfectant. In that regard, I like NAEP, and I think there should be more NAEP. Here, I'm coming out for more Department of Education, but that's not terribly expensive. By the way, why do we do 4th and 8th and not 12th? Can someone explain that to me? We need to do 12th. It's crazy. And I think that's a measure of excellence. It's a great test, and I think that's a very good thing. In terms of equity, sure, that's what you got an Office of Civil Rights for. But I think you got an Office of Civil Rights that's run amok now. I mean, these dear colleague letters about gender bathrooms, about disparate impact, about everything else, I think it's just crazy. It's just gotten way out of bounds. And people in the states dread it. Finally, on early childhood education, I'm open to it. But I'll tell you, I remember saying when I was Secretary of Education, what was that, 100 years ago, that if you don't know how to make an omelet and you got 8 eggs, if you add it to 12, you still don't know how to make an omelet. If you add it to 14, it's still a bad omelet. We got to get educational practice right. I want to know what we're doing in the classrooms, and we're obviously doing a lot of things wrong. But in terms of the pivotal question, there is no balance between the federal and the states. The states, this is the state's responsibility. There's no constitutional basis for this kind of federal involvement. You're there to help and then basically get out of the way. When we did a survey of the recipients of federal grants when I was there, we asked them what was the single best federal program, what was their favorite one, the one they thought was the best. You know what got the most votes? The block grant. Mm-hmm. Now let's just reflect on that for a second. They send their money to us, we send it back to them. Great program, thank you very much. Except we took, what, 15, 20% out. The notion that the states are these irascible children, these juvenile delinquents that need to be brought to heel all the time is, I think, just wrong-headed. Where states are violating civil rights, of course you step in, and of course the courts must step in. But working with conservative leaders for education, the state legislatures, there are more good ideas out there. And if we paid more attention to the good ideas that are circulating in the states, percolating in the states, and taking hold in the states, look at Louisiana, what John White is doing in Louisiana, what others are doing elsewhere, and other states, Mike Wilson in Kentucky, Howard Stevenson in Utah. These are the laboratories, and they are producing some very good results.
Let me follow up with you, Rod, and you, Roberto, on the question of the states, not just as laboratories, but really the states with the responsibility for the education of children. Is there a role for the Department of Education, for the federal government, in terms of, and Bill, maybe you'd like to get back in here too, on best practices? So one of the questions is, if we're going to have the states as laboratories, we'd like not to have them be closed laboratories, right? We'd like to have those results and those experiments more widely available. Do you see a way that you can use a national platform to help with the best practices?
Actually, there are ways, but these ways are going to be very difficult to come about to get complete consensus around the corner with that. In the No Child Left Behind Act authorization, we ran dead into this federalism idea. You know, we're reminded often that the U.S. Constitution doesn't even mention K-12 education. And the 10th Amendment says that if it doesn't, then that means that it's the responsibility of the states. And we're reminded of that really often. But there are some circumstances that we all share, all of the states. For example, let's take, for example, civics. Everybody in our nation should understand how our system works. Kids should be taught how our system works. That should be an understanding of the history of our nation. All states that should be the same all across the United States. And obviously, it's a combination of the two. The combination being that there are things that states should have the prerogative to do, and there are things that are common that we all need to do in order to be one nation. I also was reminded of that with visitors to me while I was in the cabinet. Well, many people who came by said we shouldn't even be there, the United States Department of Education, because we're not needed. But we are one nation under God.
Yeah, right. Roberto, you want to?
So, I think I have a slightly different take on this, but I will say I feel like this debate around federal versus state, it is a decades-old tug of war here around the locus of control in our education system. And I'm encouraged because I actually feel like we have finally gotten to a place on a bipartisan basis that calls back some of the important hallmarks that were part of the passage of No Child Left Behind, which is to say there is a federal-state partnership here that is needed if we're going to support the success of all of our children. The states certainly have an important role and agency in moving that forward, but the federal government has an important role here to provide for equity, to make sure that we are ensuring accountability for the progress of all of our children. And over the course of ESSA's evolution, we have seen, our English learners, our students with disabilities, our children by race and income fully included in that account. These are populations that unfortunately were at the margins of our discussions around educational opportunity for years. So we have an important responsibility to move that forward, and I would hope we can not backslide into more ideologically driven discussion around is it the states or is it the federal government, and say, well, how can we embrace this shared responsibility that we have for supporting the education of all of our students. I think there's some great state leaders doing wonderful work. I'm a big fan of John down in Louisiana. I think he'll tell you there needs to be a federal role in education. It is not to prescribe, it is not to standardize what teaching and learning looks like in our classrooms. It is to make sure that we support the premise of accountability for all students. And if we don't do that, educational opportunity will be an opportunity denied, unfortunately, on the basis of a student's background or race or income or language they speak or zip code in which they grow up. And we can't afford to move backward as a country in that manner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Arne, were you going to?
Where this is complicated, and I don't want to sort of paper over the complexity of this, is one of the biggest block grants, as everyone knows, is Title I. Title I is supposed to help poor kids who we know disproportionately need a great education if we're going to break cycles of poverty. And this gets a little wonky, but most folks in this room will understand this. Right now, there's a massive debate about supplement, not supplant. And the challenge right now is that Title I money that is supposed to follow and flow to poor kids is actually in many places flowing to more middle class and affluent kids in schools. And that's not the purpose of that block grant. It's not helping the kids who need the biggest help. And there's massive pushback, let me be clear, from both the left and the right to make sure that Title I resources actually go to the poor kids and poor communities who need that most. That's a little mind-boggling to me, but that's playing out in real time now. And that, for me, I think is a prime example of how the traditional politics on both the left and the right don't benefit the kids who I think so many of us are trying to fight for.
Yeah. Bill, did you want to comment? You were.
No. I think that's a good example. I don't want to prolong the debate, but I do think it, not to get into an ideological cul-de-sac, but I do think it's important to get basic principles right. And I think if one doesn't understand or appreciate or agree to the point that this is primarily a responsibility of the states and locales, that one gets into a lot of difficulty. Let's take another area, higher education. By the way, I would hope that in looking at higher education and readiness for higher education or career, people will look, the new secretary will look at alternatives to college. I'm for college, graduate school, law school, I went to all of them. A lot of kids, it's not right, and it doesn't serve them, and they end up in debt, not knowing anything, and frustrated. And keeping off adulthood, too. Heard about a seminar in Portland being run called Adulthood. It's run for millennials who don't know anything about adulthood. Because this psychiatrist was reading all these reports, all these kids said, I don't like this paying bills and getting up in the morning, I'm going back to college. Great comment about college implicitly there. But here the federal government enters into higher education and higher education funding, and I hope we can get the private sector back into that, by the way, I'll say again. And as a result, 30 years, 20, 30, 40 years later, we have fewer poorer students as a percentage going to college than was intended by the legislation. Same point you're making. The middle class is benefiting and the poor kids aren't. Poor kids, it's so far out of reach because of what happens to the colleges with tuitions. So, I'd look at that. By the way, the Perkins, getting into the weeds here, Perkins situation is in limbo, and I hope that can be looked at. I want to make one other point, since I guess I'm dissenting here on a number of points, and that is this celebration of innovation. A thing is not good because it's new. A thing is good if it's good. A thing is not bad because it's old. A thing is bad if it's bad. Let me give you. There are some great innovations, and I think technology, although it's still mixed, is a great innovation. But consider the following: the open classroom, the new math, values clarification, social studies. These were all innovations, and I think, I would argue they were all bad ideas. Things have to be evaluated. Civics would be preferable to social studies. They have to be evaluated on their merits. When we put out booklets, back when I was there, we didn't talk about new practices. We had a series called What Works, and I think that is a real function of the Department of Education. What works? We see these results in Mississippi. Boy, they're terrific. Maybe other states should do this. Now, again, we'll do this at conservative leaders at a state level, but one needs to be careful of the siren call of innovation. Not all new ideas are good. Just ask the market about new ideas. 95% of new ideas fail because they don't really work. They are new, but they don't work.
Thanks. Let's talk about exactly that: innovation, technology, transformation. So I come from Silicon Valley, and Bill is absolutely right. There's a sense that technology is always good. And in fact, technology is neutral. It's how it's used that makes it actually good or bad. How does it sync up with institutions and needs? And there's a lot of talk now about personalization of learning. There's a lot of talk about technology supplanting really the human in the classroom for at least some of education. There are lots of ideas out there. But somehow what we need are transformative ideas that are still going to get to the core of how do you educate the child better, regardless of the circumstances from which that child comes. So if you could name one innovation, and I'm using that word not in the sense of technology, something that's transformative for a system that has been incredibly resistant to transformative change. I think we can all agree that with all of the time we've spent on education reform, with all of the effort that's gone in, this system is still really, really hard to change, particularly where poor kids are concerned. If you could wave a wand and make one transformative change, what would it be? You want to start, Roberto?
Sure. Well, it's hard to narrow that list down to one, but I will say I think there's tremendous potential for personalization in our education system. You know, the work that we have seen take shape, as Arne mentioned, through the Investing in Innovation Fund, through the Race to the Top district program. I mean, we have, just take an example like St. Vrain Valley Schools. This is a district north of Colorado that has looked at one-to-one learning in its high schools. That was spurred by the Investing in Innovation Fund, but where they've been able to really bring a blended learning model and an individualized, more personalized, competency-based model for their students across the entire district. And what that's done is it's been able to meet young people where they are, help them accelerate to get ahead those that might be overaged and undercredited in high school, but also help those students that are further ahead get even further beyond. We need so desperately in our education system, if we're going to bridge the opportunity and achievement gaps we have in the system, we so desperately need to embrace new ways of what teaching and learning looks like. And that's not to suggest a federal prescription, because again, these are not ideas that are set at the federal level. These are ideas where we can provide incentives and supports for local school leaders, state leaders to move forward. You know, another is looking at career and technical education. How do we reinvigorate career and technical education to align to college and career-ready standards so that young people can actually participate in work-based learning, can have hands-on learning experiences, project-based learning, that will help them not only prepare for college, but prepare with job skills, with life skills that will help them get ahead.
Rod?
There's a small charter school in Houston called A+ Up. And it's sponsored by an organization called A+ Challenge. Small school, but the kids are just blowing the top off of a state-mandated test. And as I look at that, the key thing that I think focus is there that makes that work is they've found a way to have kids own their learning. So the kids become the owners of their progress and their learning. And the achievements that they achieve, they feel that they did it. And so there's not a lot of imposition on them, but they have found a way to own their own learning. I got to learn much more about that because I think that that's one key major change that could help us all, whether we're in comprehensive high schools or in charter schools or any kind of schools like that, if students play a greater role in owning their own education and effort. Mm-hmm. Because the bottom line is the effort that the child puts upon it in the circumstances. Mm-hmm.
I'll cheat very quickly and say two, which I know I'm not supposed to.
Yes, that's fine.
One, I always come back to early childhood education. The fact that we have millions of kids that start kindergarten every fall, a year to 18 months behind, and we never catch them up, and they eventually drop out, and we eventually lock them up. We spend $60,000 at the back end to lock them up. Somehow we have to decide as a country we'd rather invest early than late. Secondly, and I think Bill's point's a really good one, when I talk about innovation, it's not new ideas, it's evidence-based innovation. And for all of our challenges, I visited all 50 states. I probably visited more schools across the country during the time than anyone anybody. There's amazing work going on out there, as we all know. Rural communities, remote communities, Native American reservations, urban, suburban. What we don't do, Connie, is we don't scale. And so I would go back to a massive investment in evidence-based innovation and where you're getting good results in Appalachia, where you're getting good results in, on a reservation. Let's help you serve more kids doing what you're doing. And those funds went down rather than up.
Mm-hmm. Bill?
As I said to Condi earlier, at strength of schedule, I'm approaching 600 schools. Where are you? I've been in 600 schools.
We'll be close.
Okay, we'll talk. All right. Okay. I'm not going to challenge them in basketball, that's for sure. maybe school visits. I will repeat what I said, I guess 30 years ago. They said, Mr. Secretary, if you could wave a magic, this is making me very nostalgic, this panel, all these wonderful people. If you could wave a magic wand and improve American education for young people, what would you do? I said, I'd get rid of puberty. And if you think about it, it's a hell of a distraction. It really is. And the press wrote it up and said, spoken like a real conservative. They're opposed to puberty, they're opposed to all of that stuff, I didn't mean it, but it is true. I mean, you go into a middle school or junior high school, the building vibrates. It vibrates. I would recommend, you're absolutely right about Silicon Valley. And, the other thing I found out when I was in Silicon Valley, when I met with some of the school board members, they said, we're looking for math science teachers.
Yeah.
I said, you got to be kidding. You don't have talent here? Well, they're not certified. That's another thing we'll talk about. I think American teachers are on the whole good, and many of them are very good. I think the unions that represent them are bad. I love the teachers, but I hate the professional organization. I think they're a major obstacle to improvement and progress. And everybody who digs into this and tries to really push for education reform sooner or later runs into this. And I would say to the states, we want to help you there too. If you have great ideas and they're being opposed because of the union organizations, we can help you. But the innovation I would talk about, and I don't mean this ironically, is I'm coming around, as I was saying to folks at the table, to the importance of the work that E.D. Hirsch did, content and reading, in-depth reading. I agree with Mr. Rodriguez. The sheer dollar value of intellectual capital has never been higher. And there is so much overwhelming evidence that to read in depth, even read slowly in depth, and to grasp whatever the subject is, frogs' legs, music, horticulture, architecture, gives you an ability and a vocabulary which enables you to function in other fields and other areas. I am struck by the overwhelming evidence of how one increases one's confidence, one's intellectual confidence, and one's vocabulary, which is very important, often a proxy for other intellectual abilities, by devotion to reading. What's that statistic about the average wait time when a kid clicks on and it doesn't come up? Is it 2.5 seconds? We have to do better. We have to do better than that, because you can't raise children and do a lot of other things in 2.5 seconds.
We've only got a few minutes, and so I'm going to ask you for a kind of lightning round on the following final question. When you think about the now some 40 years or so that spanned on this stage, more than that spanned on this stage in terms of reform, what makes you most cautious about our ability to finally deliver? In other words, what worries you most? And secondly, what makes you most hopeful that we might actually, when we return to these meetings, be able to say, yeah, we've made it better for larger numbers of kids, particularly underserved kids? So what's your worst nightmare and your best hope?
Well, I think I've said this before, but I'll repeat it. I'm concerned about the gap between policymakers and practitioners. If schools change, that change will be a response to the people in the schools. And so it is controlled completely by the practitioners. And so there needs to be a closer collaboration between policymakers and practitioners. That is going to be required in order for us to move forward.
And your best hope would be that that happens?
Yeah, that's good.
Got it. All right. Roberto.
Well, I agree with Secretary Paige. I think we need to attend to bridging that gap more actively between our practitioners and our policymakers if we're going to achieve real change. I also worry, I guess one of my principal worries is that standards-based reform, as it's played out on the policy stage, both in the states as well as on the federal level, over the past several decades now, often gets mistaken as a standardization of teaching and learning for kids in the classroom. And I think, I worry that we're not quite at a place yet as a country where we can agree and where we all will embrace the notion that says we can have high college and career-ready standards for all students. We can have accountability for all students. We can ensure that we have good measures for progress underneath those standards. But the teaching and learning experience of our students has to be individualized. It has to meet them where they are and help them get ahead. And we need to embrace and support our teachers and our school leaders and our principals in that effort. I think we need a national acknowledgement of that work. And I think my greatest hope is that we continue to scale what works in our system and that we attend to evidence. I love the conversation we've had this morning on evidence because I think that's been a great evolution across the federal stage. We need more room for research and development and evaluation and failure and refinement in our education system. We need to provide more room and more support for that so that we can truly figure out what works and then, as Arne mentioned, scale that across the system. That is that's my great hope if we're able to close the achievement gap.
Thank you. Arne?
Least hopeful about our lack of clarity around goals and our lack of willingness to hold ourselves accountable and measure them. And I've never met a politician who didn't say they were pro-education, they love kissing babies, they love visiting schools, but very few actually hold themselves accountable publicly for results. Governor Bush being a very important counterexample of that. What I'm most helpful, one very concrete example is not too many years ago, we had 2,000 dropout factories in the nation. 2,000 high schools where disproportionately kids were failing and being set up for failure in life. We have gone from 2,000 to 800. We've cut that by more than half. Could we as a nation eradicate dropout factories over the next 4, 5, 6 years? That would change kids' lives and communities' lives forever.
Okay, perfect. Before I turn to Bill, let me just say I think we're going to have just a few minutes for audience Q&A, and so I don't actually see mic runners. Are they here? Right. So get your questions ready. I am a professor. I will call on somebody if nobody asks a question. So, Bill, you get the last one.
The worries are these. Congratulations on the dropout rate you just reported. That's good. My abiding worry is what did the students know who've graduated, and how much do they know and how little do they know? Because employers tell us it's grounds for worry. They tell us that over and over again. The other worry is, after all this talent, all the money that's been spent, look from the late 70s, early 80s on, and it's flat. Our performance is flat. Saw the TIMSS scores yesterday, up a little in 4th and 8th grade math. Otherwise, we're just not doing it. We're not getting there. What's my grounds for optimism? Always up for a new start. Always up for something that provides an opportunity. And I think ESSA is a great opportunity. Every Student Succeeds Act, getting the responsibility back where it belongs with the people who have that responsibility and are close to the ground, close to parents, and close to the kids.
Thank you. All right. Do we have a few questions or comments from the audience? Back here, the gentleman back there, can somebody get a mic to the gentleman behind you, and then here, down here, number 4, can you come down this way? Okay, right, we'll get you, I promise. All right, go right ahead, sir.
Good afternoon. We've spent a lot of time this morning hearing about state report cards and letter grades on state report cards. We have the nation's report card. Would you advocate for a letter grade for the United States?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would too.
You would?
And I would have a letter grade. This is where I'd be pretty tough. I'd have a letter grade for the states, and I'd have a letter grade for districts, and I would make public the performance of schools. Sunlight's the best disinfectant. Lets everybody do the best job they can and look at the results. Be sure you factor into that all the inputs, students, student background, parental background, income, but let's look at where you started and let's look at where you ended. Straight schedule, entire body of work.
And we don't have a letter grade, but we do have a ranking. I mean, we look at the PISA, right? And the PISA tells us we are 28 out of 38 developed nations with access to preschool in terms of our 4-year-olds. Tells us that we're in the middle to the lower end of the pack relative to our math and science achievement for our 15-year-olds. So I think we're not lacking a ranking. What we're lacking is the political will as a country to change, to actually do better. I think that's what's needed more than anything.
What's important about the letter grade is people understand the letter grade. The ranking is much more complicated for people to understand. So a letter grade sends a message to everyone and they get the same answer.
Just quickly on, implicit in that question, I think is the right thing, is that the letter grade would mean the same in Mississippi and Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. And today it doesn't. Then the second thing would be, if the grade is not a high one, a grade never changed a kid's life. What changed a kid's life is great teachers and principals and intervening. So the question is, when that grade is not a good one for those kids or those communities, are we okay just saying that, or are we actually going to do something about it and change the educational opportunity for that community?
Right. Card number 1, yes.
One of the things that we're facing in the 21st century is the threat of technological unemployment. So when I hear people speak about college and career ready, I wonder what colleges and what careers, and I don't hear anything, I haven't heard any attempt to address the fact that our education system is fundamentally flawed with respect to training our children to face what the 21st century is going to present to them. I mean, learning how to learn is what they need.
No.
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Yes.
We don't know what the 21st century is going to present them with. Neither do they, neither do you. We don't know what's going to happen in 2050. What we owe them is the best knowledge we have, the best experience we have in getting people ready. Readiness is all. That means a certain kind of intellectual readiness, a literacy, a depth of knowledge, the ability to read, the ability to understand and to grasp. I don't mean to be so harsh, but we don't know the future. So what we do is prepare students for the future by doing the best we can with what has worked in the past. And if you look at the people who have succeeded in the incredible innovations of the last 50 years, you will see that most of them have had a fairly, actually quite traditional education in the basics, where there wasn't an emphasis on learning how to learn, there was an emphasis on learning something, and then they were ready. Yeah. Excuse me, I feel very strongly about it. Okay. Give the lady a right of rebuttal.
Card number 4.
I'm just elaborating a bit on what Secretary Paige and the themes that he was making. If the product we're talking about is education, this single distribution channel we have for that product is through the teacher. It is how this whole debate, whether we pay for it through ESSA or status quo, all gets distributed through one point of contact to that student, and it's the teacher. And what I believe Secretary Paige was alluding is we have policy, but that our practitioners aren't necessarily included in the making of that policy to the degree that we might be as adequate. And my question is, how can we do that? How can teachers feel empowered that they're not subject to compliance or subject to policy, but they're actually included as part of the policy while still overcoming some of the friction that we encounter with the unions?
Arne, you want to take a crack there?
I'll start. It's a great question. One very positive example is something that we have supported, but has absolutely been teacher-led, is the Teach to Lead movement. And you have teachers all over the country, very organically, very much at grassroots, who are now starting to shape policy, who are now stepping up, and at the district and state, and we had a teacher ambassador fellowship where teachers were at our policy-making table every single day. So it's still early. I wouldn't say we're at critical mass yet, but very, very interesting work, absolutely teacher-led, not saying, please give us a seat at the table, but demanding a seat at the table, creating a seat at the table, and that voice, to Secretary Paige's point, is extraordinarily important and helpful. One thing we just haven't talked, a little bit related, but just want to put out there, our nation's schools of education, our teacher prep programs, if they got a letter grade, that might not be too pretty. And we have to really start to think about, if we honestly believe teachers make a huge difference in kids' lives, are we truly preparing them to be successful? And the honest answer is, in way too many places, we're not.
Placard number 3.
Sorry?
I just was pointing to number 3 over here, yes.
My question is around personalized learning and education. Realistically, could there be an individual profile on every student in this country that clearly defines where they are beyond just annual test or summative testing, where the teacher could understand where exactly the student is, the individual school could understand, and ultimately we start talking about grading schools and states, where till you get to the standpoint of understanding where that individual student is on a day-to-day basis. And I'm thinking of a standpoint of, from a technology standpoint of real-time understanding every day, every week, where that child is.
Roberto, you want to take this?
I think that's where we need to go. I mean, I think you do see some really innovative work going on around formative assessment, around really measuring where students are in real time and feeding that back to teachers and to school leaders so that they can respond in real time to help them succeed. We've made great strides with technology, I think, in this space. Our administration has certainly invested a lot in helping build state systems, longitudinal data systems. I don't know that we'll see that at the national level, but certainly I think states can move forward and think about, in addition to some of the demographic data, how do we build in learning, the results of teaching and learning more actively in a student's life. So I think it's possible.
Great. Placard number 6.
Dr. Z. Richard Zeiler, member of Michigan State Board of Education. There's been a lot of talk about transparency, but are we prepared for what might be revealed? In my experience, educators convince themselves of mutually exclusive goals or values. For example, we're going to respect the values of every cultural group that appears in our classroom. But we're also going to affirm the equality of women. So when our Hispanic student manifests some macho activities, well, I don't have to tell you on which side, which value most of our teachers come down on. In the same way, there are...
Sir, we're going to run out of time, so can we just take it from there?
Certainly.
All right, good. Bill.
So you cut off the professor in the middle of his question. You ask another professor to answer the question in short order. I didn't know what that meant. I'm sorry. I don't know what you're talking about. Can I say something about teachers?
Yes, you can say something else.
Teachers as legislators. Here's a model, but I know we can't do this. One of our great legislators in the States is Paul Boyer. He's a classroom teacher, and he's the chairman of the Education Committee of the Arizona House. That's great. Now, if you can't do that, as a legislator, have a team of teachers as part of your advisory group. And a lot of our members and the Conservative Leaders for Education are teachers, occasional teachers in the classrooms, use teachers as a sounding board. But I was so impressed to see a classroom teacher leading the efforts at innovation at the state level based on what he sees every day in the classroom. Yeah. Sorry, Professor.
That's right. I am going to ask Roberto, though, because it is actually an interesting problem. Culture in the classroom. Kids come from different perspectives, different backgrounds. But Rod's talked about our need to have a kind of common view of our history and the like.
Right.
And these are actually pretty hard questions if you're in the classroom. I've confronted them myself. And so, how do you think about it?
Well, and we all remember the culture wars and all of the debates we've had around curriculum, and that's probably another panel. But I will say, I think we need to return to our hallmarks as a country. Our democratic hallmarks, our hallmarks around pluralism, and our respect for diverse views and cultures. I think there's a lot we can do to teach those values in civics, but even apart from civic education, and just making sure we are returning to the democratic hallmarks of what our public education system is all about. And I think there's a responsibility, particularly as educators. We have a trust, right? You are nation builders as educators. You are building and supporting one of our greatest resources. So there is a real importance in making sure that we live those values. And if there are, if we're crossing the line here with respect to environments, hostile environments in which kids spend time or learn or grow, then we have federal civil rights laws on that which we need to uphold and we need to enforce. And I certainly believe our Department of Education has a responsibility to enforce those.
We are unfortunately out of time, but I'm going to take the privilege as chair just to say one word about this issue, because I do think it's very important that the classroom be a classroom in which every child can learn and every child believes that he or she is valued. That's very important. I do tell my students sometimes, you don't have a constitutional right not to be offended. Right. And so to learn somehow,
that's right.
Within the context of it, to deal with people who are different. And so I invoke the following rule in my classroom when it comes to questions of gender and identity and the like and how we treat each other. Let's try the golden rule. How about you treat everyone as you would like to be treated, and then this classroom will be one in which everybody feels comfortable. So thanks, folks. It was great being with you, and thanks to the panelists.